You. Yes, I'm talking directly to you. And I'll start with a simple thing. You live in virtual reality because all the sensations you experience from birth to death are created by your brain. The brain constructs an internal virtual environment that exactly replicates the external world, or doesn't. How can you even know if something is wrong with the reality you observe? Maybe the world contains anomalies. The first thought that probably comes to your mind as a modern person is that I'm talking about a simulation, but it's much more complicated. The vast majority of people who believe in the simulation hypothesis imagine the external world in a very specific way. I conclude this because the most popular work on the subject is Nick Bostrom's article, The Simulation Argument. Bostrom's argument goes like this. One day, humanity will be able to create many simulations of the universe, indistinguishable from the original. In those simulations, people will appear who will eventually also create simulations of their own universes, indistinguishable from the original, and so on infinitely. The probability that we are at the beginning of this chain is close to zero. See? Doesn't sound super convincing, but after Elon Musk retold this argument, it blew everyone's mind. But honestly, in Musk's place, anyone would think they're living in a simulation. What I'm saying is this. In the mind of the average person who believes in the simulation hypothesis, the real original world outside the simulation is the same world in terms of physical laws. And this is where it gets interesting, because in the world familiar to you, there is at least one anomaly that first cannot yet be explained by known laws of the universe, and second, we have no idea what kind of laws could explain it. Imagine your memory is erased and you're plugged into a simulation with incorrect physical laws. What could you learn about external reality? At first glance, absolutely nothing. But that's not true. By studying the properties of the program controlling your confinement, understanding the laws it follows, you wouldn't stop there. No, you would try to explain the origin of the properties of various objects observed in the reality you live in, including yourself. Eventually, you would conclude that a complete explanation doesn't exist. You'd realize that the very fact of your existence cannot be derived from the laws of the world you're in. Let me give an even clearer and simpler example. Suppose you find yourself in a first-person chess game as the king. The first thing you do is study the physical laws of that environment and the consequences arising from them. That a knight moves in an L shape, that it can jump over other pieces, that having 9 white or 9 black pawns is physically impossible, and so on. After studying all the laws of the chess world, you'd conclude that these rules are far too simple to produce consciousness. So you'd conclude that your own thought processes couldn't have arisen within the universe in which you found yourself. The more elaborate the simulation, the longer you'll remain under the illusion that your simulated world is real. And if your jailers want you to never suspect you're in a simulation, it's not enough to simply cut you off from the outside world. The simulation must be fully self-sufficient, internally consistent in all its explanations. Every answer to every question you ask about the surrounding world must be woven into the structure of the simulated physical reality. This is the essence of the so-called principle of causal closure of the physical world. According to this principle, every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause for its emergence. The universe contains everything necessary to fully explain any of its elements, and it is complete or closed in the sense that no non-physical causes are required for such explanation. And although the principle of causal closure is a fundamental principle in physics, many thinkers seriously doubt whether any part of reality, let alone all of it, is truly causally closed. Doubt. Doubt led Newton to the law of universal gravitation, Einstein to the theory of relativity. Doubt will likely lead humanity to the theory of quantum gravity, and it also leads people to flat earth theory and reptilian conspiracies. Human doubt is endless. You can doubt global warming, the existence of spoons, or ancient Rome. You can doubt the moon landing, that 2 times 2 equals 4, even the existence of your own body. But what you can't doubt is that you're doubting. I doubt, therefore I think, and therefore I exist. These words are often attributed to René Descartes, but Descartes himself didn't want the statement to look like a logical conclusion, and in his Meditations on First Philosophy, He insisted on another formulation. Simply, I am. I exist. Because for the one who says it, this statement is self-evident, requires no justification, and is an axiom. Many believe that modern science began with Descartes, with his principle of starting from the indubitable, from that which cannot be denied. Thus, you may believe the world is illusory, that everything around you is a simulation, or that you're actually a brain in a jar, and some of that may be true. Maybe even all of it. You'll never know for sure. But what you do know right now, and know with certainty, is that you are aware of your own existence. Consciousness. Many believe it's not accepted to talk about it in scientific circles. But that's not true. Max Planck said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Consciousness is a term that refers to a lot of different things. Type consciousness into YouTube, and you'll get hundreds of thousands of fuzzy TEDx videos. As you can see, I decided to add one more. Some videos talk about the immortal soul, others about neurophysiological processes. Some say consciousness has nothing to do with the soul or the brain, and others say consciousness doesn't exist. All this shows how little humanity truly understands what we call consciousness. For hundreds of years, not even a commonly accepted definition has been established. Of course, most people intuitively understand what is being discussed. Consciousness is something like a property of a system, the system's ability to detect its own existence. But how can ordinary matter, arranged in a particular way, suddenly generate subjective experience? The distinguished physicist and mathematician Roger Penrose writes in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, concerning computers, minds, and the laws of physics, it seems to me that most of the brain's work is algorithmic in nature. I firmly believe in the power of natural selection, but I don't understand how natural selection could create algorithms that in some way possess conscious appreciation of other already existing algorithms. If the concept of God can be dismissed, as Laplace once said, "Sir, I have no need of that hypothesis to explain the universe," then the paradox of consciousness is that it is just as ephemeral as the concept of God, yet consciousness is the only thing directly accessible to you, the only thing whose existence you cannot doubt. Subjective experience is the starting point upon which all human knowledge of the external world is built, and yet all human knowledge of the external world cannot explain subjective experience. As Schopenhauer wrote in his major work, that which knows everything and is known by none, that is the subject. Thus, an organ weighing about 1.5 kilograms can generate the feeling of life. Consciousness is an anomalous phenomenon, entirely unlike any other in the natural world. In 1980, psychologist and author Stuart Sutherland noted in the International Dictionary of Psychology, consciousness is an astonishing yet elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. You might say, but surely consciousness gives us an evolutionary advantage. If that's the case, then it is entirely unclear what that advantage is. All your cognitive processes could very well occur in the dark, as was the case with Kenneth Parkes. In 1987, he left his house in a suburb of Toronto, started his car, and drove 23 kilometers to his in-laws' house. He got out of the car, retrieved a tire iron from the trunk, unlocked the door with his key, strangled his father-in-law, Dennis Woods, beat his mother-in-law, Barbara Ann Woods, and then stabbed her to death with a kitchen knife. After leaving the house, he got back in his car and woke up. Kenneth Parkes was a hereditary sleepwalker. Experts concluded that he experienced an unusually deep form of sleep. Parkes was acquitted. As you can see, complex cognitive functions don't necessarily require consciousness. After all, one day we will create robots whose behavior is indistinguishable from that of humans. These robots will analyze the surrounding world just like you, make predictions, converse, perhaps even express emotions. But will you say that they, like you, possess consciousness? Or will you? In 1950, British mathematician, logician, and cryptographer Alan Turing whose contributions to computer science were immense, began his prophetic paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, with the question, can machines think? He goes on to say that in order to answer this question, we must first define what we mean by machines and thinking. And since we have no strict definitions of either, he suggests replacing the question, can machines think, with can machines do what we, as thinking beings, can do? He then describes a test designed to answer this question. Today it's known as the Turing Test. You've probably heard of it. In short, a machine is said to pass the test if a human, communicating with it via text messages, cannot tell whether they're talking to a human or a computer. The problem with the test is that it cannot tell us whether the machine has subjective experience, whether it is aware of its own existence. A machine can imitate thinking without actually thinking. But first of all, Turing didn't aim to detect the elusive presence of consciousness. He himself didn't call it the Turing Test. He called it the imitation game, which is a rather ambiguous name. Secondly, in response to such criticism, Turing pointed out that questions about the presence of consciousness are poorly formulated. We never have direct proof of the inner states of other people. We simply agree as a social norm that everyone else thinks. Why should we hold machines to a higher standard? And thirdly, Turing wrote in his paper, I do not wish to give the impression that I think there is no mystery about consciousness. There is, for instance, the paradox connected with any attempt to locate it. But I do not think these mysteries need be solved before we can answer the question with which we are concerned here. So can machines possess consciousness? Well, you could be called a machine too. Sure, you weren't made in a factory, but there are no physical limitations preventing someone from walking outside, collecting the necessary atoms, and assembling a human. Would that human have consciousness? And here's another thought. There is nothing special about any single neuron in your brain. It's made of the same elements as everything else in the universe and obeys the same physical laws. If we started replacing every neuron in your head with high-tech artificial counterparts, would you gradually lose your sense of self? The concept of multiple realizability posits that any mental state, including consciousness, can be realized on different physical substrates. So what if someone broke me down into atoms and reassembled me instantly? Would I still be me, or would I be someone else? The problem of personal identity is a philosophical issue involving how a person at different times can regard themselves as the same individual, even though their body and mind are constantly changing. In modern philosophy of mind, the best formulation of what consciousness is, according to consensus, was provided by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel. In 1974, in the Philosophical Review, he asked the most famous question in modern consciousness studies. What is it like to be a bat? You know what it's like to see, hear, or touch the world around you. But unlike a bat, you are fundamentally incapable of experiencing the world through echolocation. According to Nagel, a being can possess consciousness only if someone is that being, if the world is perceived from a subjective point of view, from the first person. Look, do you know what this is? These are the physical properties of the color red. But as Erwin Schrödinger, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, once said, the physicist's objective picture of light waves cannot be reduced to the experience of color. So you could write a dissertation on the physics of red and still not find a single word to explain to someone with protanopia what it feels like to experience red. The same goes for consciousness. We cannot describe it or prove its existence. Many argue that we cannot conduct an experiment that would demonstrate that consciousness has any influence on the external world. How do you even know that what you're doing is the result of conscious choice? You are influenced by physical causes. You respond. The causes may be external or internal, visible or hidden. As Schopenhauer put it, a man can do what he wants but not want what he wants. The theory that consciousness is a kind of byproduct of internal physical and biochemical processes is called epiphenomenalism. A simple example. It is not fear that causes an adrenaline spike and rapid heartbeat. No, the adrenaline spike and heartbeat feel like fear. The feeling of fear is an exhaust, an epiphenomenon. That's why there are those who believe we should abandon the concept of consciousness altogether. just as the concept of the ether was once abandoned. Now let me show you someone who claims to have no inner self, at least that's what he insists. This is American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett. In his 1991 book, Consciousness Explained, Dennett attempts to demonstrate that consciousness consists of multiple streams of information competing for access to the brain, thereby governing human behavior. Dennett's explanation of human consciousness has no essential difference from the explanation of the behavior of a complex but unconscious robot governed by pre-programmed code. Many would love it if it were that simple. It would instantly resolve the problem of consciousness not being derivable from physical processes. But then, in 1993, Australian mathematician and philosopher David Chalmers entered the scene with his doctoral dissertation, where he introduced the term, the hard problem of consciousness. Even after we've explained the physical and computational functioning of a conscious system using traditional methods of neuroscience and cognitive science, we still must explain why that system has conscious experience. You can try to build a theory of consciousness using electrochemical processes, the work of the prefrontal cortex, or quantum effects in brain microtubules. You can say that speech comes from Broca's area, coordination from the cerebellum, emotion from the amygdala, vision from the occipital lobe. But none of this explains why something is currently aware of its physical reflection on a black screen. Unless your screen is matte, if you're actually watching and not just listening to the video. If you've read Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, stop this pseudo-intellectual chatter and reread it. That's where the real fun is. And if you have read it, then you know the author. Eliezer Yudkowsky. He's an expert in artificial intelligence. Naturally, he's interested in consciousness. In his essay, Zombie, he writes that you can imagine a perfect copy of yourself, same behavior, same speech, same brain, every atom and quark in the same place. This duplicate would be identical in every way, except it would lack consciousness. This is the so-called philosophical zombie, and the possibility of such zombies is accepted by a significant portion, if not the majority, of academic philosophers of mind. Yudkowsky writes, "You are not the one who speaks your thoughts, you are the one who hears them." A zombie, then, might have thoughts spoken in its mind, but no one to hear them. Thus, if we believe that consciousness exists and philosophical zombies are possible, we must conclude that consciousness does not interact with physical reality. That means consciousness is a non-physical property. This leads to many fascinating consequences. For instance, that we live in a simulation. But common sense suggests that one of our assumptions is probably false. Yudkowsky, for example, says the zombie argument is complete nonsense, because no zombie would ever write articles about consciousness, let alone argue about it. Some might say this is just philosophy, as if that's a bad thing. You can't claim a problem doesn't exist simply because it's philosophical. Galileo, Hooke, and Newton all considered themselves philosophers, because back then, the problems of space and time were philosophical problems. But by developing systematic, mathematical, empirical approaches, those questions branched off into a separate field, physics. That's the purpose of philosophy. It addresses difficult problems that can't yet be treated independently. And yes, philosophy also deals with the question of what counts as science. It defines the terms, boundaries, and methodology. David Chalmers, remember, the one who introduced the term the hard problem of consciousness, is not some fringe figure. He's one of the most influential philosophers of our time. His book, The Conscious Mind, In Search of a Fundamental Theory, caused a stir when it was published. Nearly every author writing about consciousness in recent decades references it. He was recently invited to speak at NASA's 17th Scientific Conference with the U.S. Air Force on the topic, "Is our universe a computer simulation?" According to Chalmers, he'd like to remain a scientific materialist, but he also honestly believes that in hundreds of years, we haven't made even an inch of progress in understanding consciousness, because our ideas have been, well, not radical enough or even crazy enough. And given the nature of consciousness, that's exactly what we need. Ideas as bold as those claiming the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, or that time is relative, or that a cat can be alive and dead at the same time. Based on the knowledge we already have, we can conclude that the universe is absurd. So why should the nature of consciousness be any different? Chalmers himself proposes a truly extravagant idea. Since every attempt to explain consciousness in physical terms leads to the hard problem, and since consciousness cannot be reduced to basic properties of matter, then perhaps consciousness itself is a basic property. And it is fundamental. It is an elementary feature of the universe, present in everything, but in humans, due to our complexity, most of all. This view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality is called panpsychism. Schrödinger wrote, "The reason why our sensory, perceiving, and thinking self is not found within our scientific worldview is easily stated in 7 words. It is itself that very worldview. It is identical with the whole, and therefore cannot be contained within it as a part." Yes, we have physics and mathematics. We have theory and extensive experimental data. Perhaps someday we will understand all conceivable aspects of physical reality and derive every equation. But in the conclusion of A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking wrote, "Even if there is only one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. What breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe?" The traditional scientific approach, building mathematical models, cannot answer the question, why should the universe described by that model exist at all? Why does the universe bother to exist? Maybe, just maybe, asking what is consciousness is the wrong place to start. Maybe the hard problem of consciousness emerges from the hard problem of matter. Thank you for watching.